The name Apache is a collective term for numerous tribes of native peoples of North America, which through many cultural customs and through a common language were agreed. The Apaches spoke 7 different, mutually intelligible Southern Athabascan Apache languages, which belong to the Athabascan languages from the Na-Dene language family. Linguistically they are thus with the Dene in the north and northwest Canada and the Alaska Dene of the northern Athabascans. The Apache tribes lived in the southeastern part of North America. The Apache tribes migrated together in the 14th and 15th centuries with the Navajo Dene from the north, presumably via the eastern foothills, the Rocky Mountains, in what is now the southwest United States as well as north of Mexico. Their tribal areas were called by the Spanish and Mexicans as Apachería. From the middle of the 18th century, it included a huge one-land area in eastern and southern Arizona, large parts of New Mexico, southern Colorado, western and southwestern Texas, and large areas of the contiguous Mexican states. How were the Apaches able to conquer such a vast area of what is now the United States and Mexico? And the second question that needs to be clarified, which special customs and habits did the Apaches use? In this video, I tell you the story about the toughest and most indomitable tribe of the native people of North America. Here we go. The Apache people were formerly included in the Navajo tribe. However, the Navajo developed a separate identity and are commonly considered as one called independent ethnie. The Navajo were very closely related to the Apache in terms of language and culture. If you want to get to the bottom of the matter more closely, then the Apache lived in the area the eastern part of the U.S. state of Arizona, the U.S. state of Texas, and the northwestern area of present-day Mexico. If the common cultural origin and the similar linguistic development are left out, there was little to no conflict between these individual tribes of the Navajo, which includes the Apaches. The chiefs of these tribes of the Navajo spoke about 7 different languages. The languages were, for example, the language of the Chihuahua Apache in the west, the Mescalero Apache in the interior, the Lipan Apache in the southeast, or the Lipan Apache in the northeast. Researchers now assume that even more Apache dialects existed. An interesting fact is that the Western Apaches are one of the very few Native Americans that remain to this day live in their original territory. More precisely, in what is now the U.S. state of Arizona. Even today you can see the cultural differences among the individual Apache tribes. So there is today, due to the different culture, corresponding many small Apache reservations in the U.S. state of Arizona. Now let's look at the period when the hot-blooded Apaches lived at the time of the colonization of the North American continent, put up fierce resistance against the settlers from Europe. First of all, the Apache tribes knew very well the terrain and land they lived on. From an early age, Apache children were raised to survive in the harsh conditions of the wilderness. In this way, the children learned to rely on themselves and their senses and abilities in the wilderness. The Apaches have earned a reputation among the white settlers as a tough, brutal, and fearless tribe. At the time when Native Americans and Europeans were trying to find a common language and trade, the Apaches were the ones who rarely made peace with the Europeans. The Apaches often led the white settlers into ambushes during skirmishes. In the year 1540, the Spanish conquistador Francisco Vázquez de Coronado was perhaps the first white person to encounter Apache natives. In 1598, his compatriot Juan de Oñate also met the Apache. He was the first to adopt the Zuni term Apache, what means enemy, which then became the word Apache. With the involuntary introduction of the horse by the Spanish after the Pueblo Rebellion from the year 1680, the mobility and radius of action of the Apache groups increased enormously. From the Arkansas River in southern Colorado, north to the Mexican states of Sonora, Sinaloa, Chihuahua, Coahuila, Durango and Jalisco in the south, From the Colorado River in the west, to central and south Texas in the east, the Apaches plundered native and white holdings alike. Thousands of other natives and whites were killed and abducted, and entire regions were depopulated. This allowed the Apaches largely kept the Spanish and Mexicans out of their territory, which the Spanish called Apachería. For common protection and to isolate the Apaches, the Spanish and later the Mexicans formed alliances with the tribes of Pima, Opata, Tarahumara, Pueblo, Wichita, Caddo, and Ute. From the year 1786, they formed also alliances with the Comanche tribe. In return, the Spanish and Mexicans opened their markets to the natives and provided the tribes with weapons and logistical support in their battles against the Apaches. Additionally, it should be noted that the Apaches used gunpowder and firearms before the arrival of the colonists from Europe didn't know. After the adoption of firearms, in the earlier form of muskets and later rifles and revolvers, the Apaches could more effectively hunt prey animals like bison, and were better able to fight their enemies, like European and later American settlers put up a fight. The American settlers still had a numerically superior army compared to the number of Apache warriors. This was one of the reasons the Apaches avoided direct battles and led the settlers' armies into ambushes or preferred a guerrilla war. The tribe of the Lipan Apache differed from that of the other Apaches. In all characteristics, the Lipan Apaches were more brutal and less scrupulous. Thus, the early European settlers led the Lipan Apaches more than any other Apache. There are sources reporting that the Lipan practiced cannibalism in the 18th century. The Lipan Apaches lived on the southern borders of what is now the United States and Mexico. After epidemics and wars with Spain, in which a lot of blood was shed, the number of Lipans decreased significantly. After the emergence of the United States of America, the Lipan Apaches initially formed an alliance with the USA. But the alliance didn't last long, and after some small-scale raids on settlers in what is now Texas, the USA declared war on the Lipan Apaches, and so in 1881, the last Lipan Apaches were wiped out. In the period between 1845 and 1856, the Lipan Apaches suffered their greatest defeats against the United States. Later, when the USA took over former Mexican areas, the Apaches fought bitter battles with the U.S. Army. The Apache Wars of the years 1850 to 1890 were the longest and costliest U.S. wars of the 19th century, alongside the American Civil War. By their speed and cruelty, as well their desperate and prolonged resistance, many Apache leaders became famous. Only towards the end of the 19th century did the last Apaches capitulate and move to reservations. One of the goals of the American settlers at that time was the annihilation of the Native Americans living on the border of the state of Texas settled. Many of the Apaches alive today rejected the prescribed life on the reservations and moved to the big cities. The largest Apache communities today are in Oklahoma City, Kansas City, and Phoenix. Some Apaches now work as seasonal farm workers. For this reason, they do not live far from farms' major centers of today's United States. An interesting fact is, the criminal subcult that flourished in France in the early 19th century were called Apaches because they were tirelessly wild and rebellious. At that time, the Europeans and Americans ascribed exactly these characteristics to the Apache tribe. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please subscribe and give it a thumbs up. See you soon. Your channel History Best.